Hello, you're watching Context. I'm Orkan Amashov here to pose pertinent and relevant questions in pursuit of eliminating and elucidating answers. The uneasy relations between Azerbaijan and Russia, already in a near crisis mode since 25th of December of last year, when an Azal flight crashed in Kazakhstan after what is believed to have been external interference in Russian airspace, have now descended to a new nadir. Following a raid carried out by Russia's Federal Security Services in the city of Yekaterinburg on the residences of Azerbaijanis, resulting in the deaths of 2 individuals and serious injuries sustained by others, Baku has accused Moscow of demonstrative, targeted and extrajudicial killings and acts of violence committed by law enforcement agencies on ethnic grounds. 9 individuals were detained in the operation. The Russian Foreign Ministry, for its part, has downplayed the allegations made by Baku, stating that the raid formed part of a wider investigation into previously committed crimes. It has also been reported that the criminal case involving the detained Azerbaijanis has been transferred to the Central Office of the Russian Investigative Committee. Reports concerning the excessive use of force continue to circulate, strengthening the view that this was an operation of a particularly violent nature. This episode has unfolded against the backdrop of growing concern over discrimination and xenophobia, not only against members of the Azerbaijani community in Russia, but also against other ethnic groups, particularly those of Central Asian origin. Indeed, the Yekaterinburg raid could also be viewed within the broader context of Azerbaijani-Russian relations, which have remained tense since the 25th of December 2024 crash of an Azerbaijani airliner in Aktau, Kazakhstan. Preliminary investigations suggest that the aircraft was damaged by foreign metal objects whilst in Russian airspace, leading to a fatal emergency landing on the opposite shore of the Caspian. Although the final report is still pending, as is often the case with such matters, it is widely believed that the Embraer 190 operating Azal's flight was struck by Russian air defense systems over Grozny, resulting in the deaths of 37 of the 67 people on board. Since that very day, relations between Baku and Moscow have continued to deteriorate. President Vladimir Putin issued an apology to President Ilham Aliyev, referring to the incident as a tragedy in Russian airspace, but he stopped short of admitting responsibility. 3 of the 4 conditions laid out by Baku remain unfulfilled. Some other episodes have further exacerbated tensions. An Azerbaijani MP was denied entry into Russia. Reports emerged of cyber attacks originating from Russian sources. And President Aliyev most notably declined to attend Moscow's Victory Parade, an event of considerable symbolic value in the Kremlin's external image projection. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan's relations with another neighbor, Iran, have also become somewhat strained. Following the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, Tehran's ambassador to Armenia claimed that Israeli drones had been used against Iran, and Azerbaijan airspace was utilized for that very purpose. But Baku firmly denied any such involvement. Joining me now to reflect on the Yekaterinburg raid, Azerbaijani-Russian relations, and the broader challenges of multi-ethnic governance in the Russian Federation is Paul Goebel, former special advisor to the US State Secretary on Soviet nationalities and Baltic affairs, and an eminent scholar on ethno-religious dynamics in the former Soviet space. Mr. Goebel, welcome to Context.
Thank you for having me.
Well, long time no see. Last time we conversed in late 2023. The world has changed considerably since that moment. Let me begin with the immediate matter at hand, so this raid. What do you make of this recent raid that took place in Yekaterinburg and the diplomatic crisis it has triggered?
Well, first off, let's remember that the crimes the people who were seized are accused of having committed were committed more than 10 years ago. So the fact that it happened now wasn't necessary. This investigation has been going on a long time, and Moscow decided that it wanted to go forward. Second, it was carried out with extreme violence. Typically, Russian police and the Russian FSB don't behave very well toward those they go after, but this seems to have been a particularly violent display of power, likely intended to intimidate ethnic Azerbaijanis in the Russian Federation, to force them to keep quiet lest they too fall victim Not surprisingly, Baku was outraged by the behavior of the officials and by the growing and xenophobia against Azerbaijanis and all non-Russians from the south, both the Caucasus and Central Asia. Azerbaijani-Russian relations have been becoming tense not only because of this incident and the shooting down of the Azerbaijani airliner, but also because there have been regular attacks by ordinary Russians or Russians in nationalist organizations on ethnic Azerbaijanis who are living and working in the Russian Federation. This crude and thuggish raid simply brought all that to a head.
And so we have established that it looks like that it's not an isolated case, but part of a wider trend. But some of the commentary from Russian lawmakers has verged on the conspiratorial. For example, Mr. Viktor Vodalsky, he happens to be a deputy of Konstantin Zatulin, deputy chair of the State Duma Committee on CIS Affairs, called Azerbaijan's reaction a momentary lapse, and also described it as a part of an Anglo-Saxon plot to destabilize the post-Soviet space. I mean, however outlandish such statements may seem, and they happen to be outlandish and some would say grotesque perhaps, what do you think reveal about Moscow's strategic anxieties?
Well, Moscow is losing control over more and more of the former Soviet space at a rapid rate. And of course, it's angry. Of course, it isn't going to ever admit that it's responsible for that its own thuggish behavior toward ethnic minorities from abroad and at home, and its brutal war in Ukraine has driven non-Russians away from it. It's never going to admit that. So it is that Moscow falls back on its usual explanation for anything it doesn't want to admit to and blames the Anglo-Saxons. Although lately there's been a back and forth between whether they're going to speak of the Anglo-Saxons now that there is daylight between London and Washington. So sometimes they'll just blame the Americans or just blame the British. But the Duma members seem to be stuck in the Anglo-Saxon mode, and so they're going to blame somebody else. There is, in my view, very little evidence that you can point to support this conspiratorial view, but it is absolutely consistent with Russian rhetoric with regard to the former Soviet space.
Indeed, a lot has changed since our last conversation, and the transatlantic alliance does no longer seem or appear to be as unshakable as it was once, perhaps. So back to the South Caucasus and the relations of Azerbaijan with Russia, it has been said that just as Iran struggled to reconcile itself with the new realities created by the war of 2020, wherein Azerbaijan achieved victory over Armenia, Russia is now similarly somewhat grappling with the aftermath of its complete troop withdrawal from the Karabakh region, which followed the full restoration of Azerbaijani control over the territory. There are those who seem to believe that Moscow has now found it somewhat difficult to accept the factuality of what is now widely termed as the post-2023 status quo. That is that Azerbaijan restored its control over Karabakh, that relations between, so the peace process between Azerbaijan and Armenia is purely bilateral. What is your assessment of this assertion that Moscow is sort of grappling to accept this reality?
Moscow has been reluctant, increasingly reluctant, to accept the new reality that has emerged over the last 3 decades. The 11 former Soviet republics have moved further and further away from Moscow precisely because of Moscow's behavior. The problem that those grappling with how to improve relations between Moscow and the governments of Azerbaijan and the others is that it requires that Moscow change its approach, change its policy, fully recognize the independence of these countries and act to them as another foreign country. Moscow is not able to do that, and under Putin, it is less able to do it today than it was 5 years ago. It's going to take a change in leadership in Moscow that's willing to be more forthcoming, more friendly, more cooperative, to have some kind of rapprochement between Baku and Moscow and between all the other capitals and Moscow. I don't see Putin making that. Instead, I see him continuing to behave in ways that will further alienate people. Many of the problems that Russia is facing right now with Azerbaijan would not exist had Putin not launched his expanded invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Uh, Anyone who is a non Russian looks at the fact that Moscow feels free to send troops across an international border to bomb civilians, to kill massive numbers of people as a threat not just to Ukrainians, but to themselves. Not surprisingly, these countries are moving away from Russia, are seeking alliances with each other and alliances with outsiders. And because that's so, Moscow has a problem that it can only solve by reversing the course that Vladimir Putin has put the country on. That isn't going to happen under Vladimir Putin. So the question becomes, how soon will Putin leave the scene? And how can that happen in a way that gives some hope to bringing to power a leadership in the Russian capital that's willing to be cooperative? If Moscow had wanted to have good relations with Azerbaijan, it would have immediately apologized for the tragic downing of the plane, not waited days and days, and not try to give some kind of slippery language that would avoid taking responsibility. It would not have had a unit of the FSB or the Interior Ministry police go in and knock heads this way. Moscow has some very well trained and good policemen. It could have used those. It chose not to. Instead, it basically said, do whatever you want. And the consequences are a disaster. I'm not surprised that Azerbaijanis have responded the way they have. And I think it's going to take longer and longer for Moscow to recover the positions it had as recently as 3 years ago. And I think that we have to recognize that this is Moscow's fault, no one else's.
When I posed the self-same question, I posed a question to Russian analysts asking them why not to apologize. They said that it's not within Russian tradition to apologize over incidents of this kind. I mean, I posed this question a couple of times and the answers given were very, very similar, or within the scope of what I just said. And also, let's talk about what happened regarding Iran as well. So much has been said about Iran's supposed weakness in the aftermath of the latest escalation with Israel. I mean, do you agree with the following assertion that after what happened, after that 12-day war, Iran is now considerably weakened country? Is this my first question?
Well, I think it's difficult to say right yet just how weakened it is. Has it been weakened by this attack? Absolutely. The willingness of the Israelis and the Americans to use massive force against its nuclear facilities may or may not have put them out of permanent commission, but they've certainly shown the Iranians that they're not in a position to defend their own territory, and that is a mark of weakness in the eyes of any population. So yes, they're somewhat weakened. On the other hand, I think we make a mistake in overreading any one incident. I think that it's a continuing problem, and the Russian Azerbaijani relationship didn't start in Yekaterinburg. The Iranian relationship with Azerbaijan and with its other neighbors has a long history, and I think that what you'll see is that there are things that Iran can do to recover some of its position. There are things it can do that are not that difficult for it. It can certainly try to find the money to build the so-called Arax route south of Zengezur. It certainly can allow for more Azeri Turkish language of instruction in the schools in northwestern Iran. So I don't write off Iran as a regional power, just as I don't write off Russia. But these countries that do certain things can expect that to generate a negative reaction. And both Russia and Iran have done that. So they're both in less good positions than they could be.
And regarding the Zangezur corridor, this overland passage connecting, the proposal related to overland passage connecting Azerbaijan's mainland with Nakhchivan exclave, the debate between Azerbaijani and Armenian diplomats, analysts, is still underway. When you also take into account Aras corridor, which is to connect Azerbaijan's mainland with Nakhchivan exclave via Iranian territory, what is your evaluation of the current juncture when it comes to that ultimate necessity that Azerbaijanis should be able to connect with Nakhchivan without actually feeling that they are traversing another country?
Well, I think that one can understand that the borders in the South Caucasus were drawn by Stalin in order to increase tensions among these countries and allow Russia a better chance of divide and rule. The particular arrangement of having the Azerbaijani exclave in Nakhchivan, the former Armenian majority area in Azerbaijan, were devices, weapons, if you like, to weaken the possibility or to end the possibility that these two republics could cooperate. At the same time, I think we have to understand that the power imbalances in the Caucasus and the changed relationship internationally toward countries that move to take territory back. I mean, since February 22, there's much more talk now about the possibility that China will decide that it really can go after Taiwan now that Russia has gone after Ukraine. And I will be very surprised if at some point the government in Baku doesn't decide that it has the power and the right to try to redraw the borders that Stalin drew almost a century ago. And I expect that to happen, quite frankly, sometime within the next 5 to 10 years. I think it's a big mistake to look at the Caucasus and assume that the borders that were drawn for one set of purposes will last forever, even if the situation that gave rise to them has changed. And the change since 1920 is very large indeed. When I lived in Baku, I was struck by the people who had to line up at the Iranian consulate to get visas so that they could go by bus from Baku to Nakhchivan. That's an irritant that, quite frankly, none of the countries in the region need. Armenia could have had a deal a decade ago or more. It chose not to. It chose to go for everything on the assumption that the international community wouldn't tolerate any military move to change things. The Armenians were wrong. I understand that they live with a national ethos that we have been giving away our territory for centuries, and we have to stand here and insist. At the same time, the power imbalance between Baku and Yerevan is so great that I don't see that happening. What I do see happening is the reaching of some kind of, it will be called a peace accord. It will in fact be something less than that, that the expectations that were produced by the behavior of the Minsk group and by many in Azerbaijan and Armenia, that a peace settlement was really possible, I think were overblown. I think what you can do is come to an agreement to recognize the facts on the ground as they are now. But I don't think that there's a possibility of solving some of these deeper problems in the current round of talks.
So we're effectively saying that it's possible to sign a deal now and sort out those deeper issues at a later stage. But
I think that's very likely. I think that the international community wants that, and I think both Baku and Yerevan do. And as long as we don't confuse ourselves with thinking that anything that is signed is a peace, a permanent peace. It's no more than something that will postpone the resolution of some of these bigger problems down the pipe.
I recall 3 years ago, I think it was June of 2022, when I put to you the following question. I asked you to distinguish between Shusha Declaration, that's signed between Azerbaijan and Turkey, and Moscow Declaration, signed in February between Azerbaijan and Russia. And then I asked you the following question. I said, the Shusha Declaration had been ratified, it's an international legal treaty, but Moscow Declaration had not been ratified, and has never been ratified, by the way. That declaration does not amount to international legal treaty. Therefore, legally, Azerbaijan and Russia are not allies. And then you said something very interesting. You said that Turkey is a rising power, and Russia is a power in decline. Do you still concur with your earlier assertion made 3 years ago?
Absolutely. I think, if anything, the past 3 years have shown that Turkey is even more a rising power than many people had thought, with a far larger agenda and far more lines of pursuit of this. I think Russia is a declining power. I've said to some people the other day that there are lots of people who would like to keep the Russian Federation in one piece, but they remind me nothing so much as those in London, Paris, and Berlin 150 years ago who talked about the sick man of Europe, which was Turkey at that point. The sick man of Eurasia is Russia. It is a declining power. It's very unlikely to be in these borders for a generation. And it is facing vastly more problems, most of them of its own making, not all, but most of its own making, that will only hasten that process.
Mr. Goebel, thank you very much indeed for your time and indeed for your insights. Most grateful to you. Thank you. Well, that was Paul Goebel sharing his insights on a moment of deepening complexity in Azerbaijan-Russia relations. You've been watching Context, and see you very soon indeed.